Defendants are in court with their lawyers. The people are represented, and we'll now resume with the trial. Both juries are in the courtroom. It's my understanding the defense wishes to call another witness at this point.
That's correct, Your Honor. But first, may I mark two exhibits?
Yes.
I'd like to mark Dr. Briere's curriculum vitae as 146.
All right, Exhibit 146.
And I'd like to mark the chart, which I did not previously mark, as 147.
Yes.
Thank you. Defense calls Dr. Briere.
Raise your right hand, please, to be sworn. Would you raise your right hand, please, to be sworn? You solemnly swear that the testimony you will give in the cause now pending before this court should be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Please stand, please. Please state your full name and spell your last.
John Neil Briere, B as in boy, R-I-E-R-E.
Thank you.
All right.
Dr. Briere, what is your current occupation?
I'm an associate professor of psychiatry and the behavioral sciences at University of Southern California School of Medicine, and I'm a clinical psychologist too for the county at LA County USC Medical Center in the Department of Emergency Psychiatric Services.
With regard to your teaching position at USC, can you tell me the type of material that you cover?
In terms of providing education, I teach second-year psychiatric residents on psychological trauma, post-traumatic stress, victimization-related issues, with specific reference to their work in County USC's Psychiatric Emergency Center area. As well, I provide training and diagnosis and assessment and treatment of long-term abuse effects in clinical psychology interns who are rotating through County USC Med Center. As well, I teach third-year medical students in the area of child abuse.
And do you also do training for professionals in your field?
Yeah, I do between 2 and 4 workshops a month somewhere in the United States or Canada, range from 1 to 2 hours to 2-day workshops on the effects of psychological trauma, and most typically the long-term effects of child abuse on subsequent or later psychological development and symptomatology.
And who attends these workshops?
Psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, physicians whose medical practice requires awareness of abuse and trauma issues. As well, I provide services to various branches of the military who wish to work with or to deal with the effects of abuse on recruits. And then I give seminars for places like, I think, upcoming seminar for the Mayo Clinic, which is probably for all different kinds of physicians who are interested in this area.
Okay. You indicated you do emergency room work, is that correct?
Yes.
Could you tell me a little about that?
LA County USC Psychiatric Emergency Room, as you may or may not know, is a large sort of collecting area for several million people in the county of Los Angeles who have severe psychological or psychiatric problems. We have a walk-in emergency room as well as a police ambulance emergency room. We provide services to either people who are not psychotic or not deeply mentally ill, but who are experiencing a major overwhelming crisis or trauma in their lives at the moment, or people who are in fact quite mentally ill, who have psychoses of various types, who require immediate admission and treatment.
Do you treat individual patients as well?
Yes, I do.
And how long have you done that?
I've been providing psychotherapy to adults since I think around 1979 or 1980. I've been doing so as a licensed clinical psychologist since '85. I have a private practice as well as a public practice, and
Do you have an area of specialization within that practice?
Psychological trauma in general, I would say, in older adolescents and adults. However, I guess I'm most associated with my work on dealing with adults who are traumatized as children, primarily with reference to sexual abuse, physical abuse.
Okay. And you mentioned that you do some work for the government. Are you under contract with the Navy to do some work?
I provide point contract work for the Navy on occasion, providing mental health teaching in terms of how Navy psychiatrists and psychologists can intervene in recruits who have manifested some sort of child abuse-related problems in their work in the Navy. The military is beginning to understand that some proportion of the folks that they see who are getting into trouble or having more trouble than other people in the Navy seem to, or whatever branch of the armed forces, that those folks are more likely to have abuse histories. So that, especially the Navy, the Family Advocacy Program has been focusing more and more on providing specialized treatment to psychiatrists and psychologists to identify and treat such individuals. The other thing that I do typically in San Diego is with a section of the Navy, which is received a grant from the Navy or the Department of Defense to do a large study of incoming recruits to the Navy to assess their childhood histories and to correlate that and relate that to their adult difficulties as well as their propensity to violence in various contexts.
Okay. And I take it you have bachelor's, master's, and Ph.D.?
All those things.
In what field?
Clinical psychology at the Ph.D. level. We don't discriminate prior to that. I have a BA in psychology from UCLA. Master's degree in psychology and a PhD in clinical psychology.
And have you done any postdoctoral work? Could you tell me about that?
Did a one-year postdoctoral fellowship at UCLA, School of Medicine at Harbor, UCLA, with a specific specialization in what was then called crisis resolution and what we would now call psychological trauma.
And have you published any books in the area related to child abuse trauma?
I have published in 1989 a book entitled, I never, believe it or not, never get this straight, but
would you like to resume to help you?
I'm being ingenuous, I actually do forget this. I think it's Therapy for Adults Molested as Children Beyond Survival in 1989, which is Springer Publishing Company in New York. Then I edited a source book for Josie Bass in California called Treating Child Sexual Abuse Victims, New Directions for Mental Health Services. And then last year, towards the end of last year, I published a book called Child Abuse Trauma, Theory and Treatment of the Lasting Effects for Sage Publications, which is a major behavioral science publisher in California.
And what market are these books aimed at? Is this the popular market or is this professionals?
All of these books are for therapists, physicians, psychologists.
And are you currently involved in preparing a handbook on child maltreatment?
I'm the lead editor of 4 editors, the other editors being an attorney, a physician, a social worker. I think I'm leaving someone out. I hope they're not present. It's a large compendium to be published by the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children, and it's going to have a title something like handbook, APSAC Handbook on Treating Child Maltreatment.
Is APSAC?
It's the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children. And that handbook, which is it's been taking several years to edit, will probably take another year or so, at which point it will be I would hope, most of the state-of-the-art thinking on the various medical, legal, and psychological and social welfare aspects of childhood maltreatment.
What's it mean to be an editor? Are you correcting their grammar or are you doing something else?
The lead editor typically is responsible for making sure that the right folks are doing the right things, that it's smoothly presented, that it has some sort of unifying force. It is involved in editing. I don't actually correct people's grammar. It would be a dangerous position to find myself. What I do, though, is try to craft or determine the substantive elements to make sure that what's being said is appropriate and well supported scientifically.
So you review the material. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Short version. Have you published any articles in the area of child abuse?
Yeah, I don't actually know the number, but I think it's between 30 or 40 articles on...
well, there are 40 on the resume you gave me.
All right. I think there's a couple more now. I'm not sure. I'd say around that number of articles, either on gender or sex differences and different kinds of psychological difficulties, but primarily I would say the vast majority of them on family violence, interpersonal violence, and among those, the vast majority have been on the long-term effects of child abuse in its various forms.
Now, where are these articles published? Just the type of publication.
Okay, they've been published in psychology journals, including journals of the American Psychological Association, which is our major organization in the United States. In interpersonal violence journals like Journal of Interpersonal Violence or Victims in Violence, as well as in psychiatry journals like the American Journal of Psychiatry, Orthopsychiatry, and some specific child abuse journals like Child Abuse and Neglect.
Now, if you have an idea, can you just submit an article and they publish it automatically, or is there some sort of review process?
When I first started, it seemed like no matter what I did, they wouldn't do that. You actually have to go through quite an extensive review. These are what are known as peer-reviewed journals, which means that that your peers, hopefully people who have been selected by the editor as knowing more about these things than other folks, reviews the material and determines whether in fact it represents a contribution to the literature, whether in fact it would be useful to the readership, whether it's of a high enough level of methodological competence that it would be a real contribution.
Now, the 40 articles you referred to, do these all reflect research that you've done or participated in?
I would say that the vast majority of them involve actual research studies. The last couple of years, I've been asked more to write general sort of articles. I wrote an article in the last few months two articles actually, in the Journal of Consulting and Clinical Psychology on the methodology of sexual abuse research. And those kinds of articles are more sort of asking you to talk about how to do the research or what the stuff means, as well as being asked to do more broadly clinical writing lately. But I would say I wouldn't want to be held to this. Maybe 25 articles represent different studies. I'm not
Which you
entirely sure.
personally have conducted.
Right, or have conducted with
participated
others.
in.
Yeah.
And can you just briefly give me a general idea of the types of studies that you do? Or if one is illustrative, you could do that, whichever is easier.
My own real interests in this area have been that it seems to me that our society has had a strange phenomena occur over the years, which is that we hurt lots and lots of our kids, and then in one way or another, and of course not all children, and then when they develop psychological problems later on in life, we sort of act like this came out of nowhere. It's sort of like these symptoms or these problems popped up. My sort of agenda as a scientist has been to see if we can relate those adult things that pop up to things that we know to be true about their childhoods. So I originally did a lot of research looking at clinical groups, psychiatric inpatients and outpatients, crisis centers, etc., to see how people who were already in pretty bad psychological shape, what their childhoods were like by their own report. At the same time, we looked at university students to see if people who weren't having that much problems, could we replicate the kinds of difficulties we saw, relationships between child abuse and problems in clinical groups, could we relate those to your average undergraduate who's not necessarily a picture of mental health either, but is probably a hell of a lot further along a health continuum. As well as lately, I've been most interested in the fact that I've been a little concerned that the field has tended to focus too narrowly on either college students or clinical populations. So we've been doing research lately on general population samples. My colleague, Dr. Diana Elliott, and I just published an article on 3,000 professional women across the United States, their child abuse histories and their long-term sequelae. And we have just now completed a study, a general population study, randomly sampling a large number of people to see how they score on a new psychological test that I've developed to measure psychological trauma.
You used the word sequelae. Mm-hmm. Can you define that for us?
So the sequelae is the most accurate way you can talk about what sequelae actually means is like a correlation. If you have something now and you had something then and the two seem to go together, when you had something then, you have it now. We call that a sequel. We don't call it an effect right off the bat because we don't know. It might be that abuse caused something, but it might be that something else caused it and it just looks like abuse caused it. So the most technically accurate thing to say is the sequela effect, those things that are associated with child abuse. We have, I think, come at a significant point in the field now, and I think my recent articles have been talking about that fact that we can pretty much now link them to child abuse, but the notion of sequelae is the notion of sort of things that go along with a bad childhood that would occur later on.
In addition to the 40 articles that you talked about, have you delivered papers at a number of locations over a period of time?
Yes.
And if I tell you there are 52 listed on your CV, will that help?
It wouldn't help, but it makes me look good.
Okay. And could I ask you to speak a little more slowly?
Yeah, you could. I'm a little nervous. A couple times a year I present a paper at some major psychological or medical conference or child abuse conference around the United States or Canada. The upcoming American Psychological Association meeting in Toronto in a few weeks, for instance, I think I'm presenting 4 or 5 papers as well as doing a debate. So I would say that probably at least for the last 10 years, I've been doing a number of presentations a year at major scholarly or professional organizations.
Okay. And lastly, with regard to your background, are you a member of any editorial boards, or have you been?
I'm the methodology editor, associate editor in charge of methodology for the Journal of Interpersonal Violence. That means when articles come in, I review them for their scientific validity as opposed to any other good things that might be about them. I'm on the editorial board of the American Psychological Association's Journal of Consulting and Clinical Psychology, which is sort of our major clinical journal. I'm on the editorial board of Child Abuse and Neglect, the International Journal. I'm on the editorial board of the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children's Advisor, the ABSAC Advisor, and I think I'm on something else, but I can't.
Do you also do continuing education presentations?
Yeah, the 2 to 4 workshops I do a month are in terms of that sort of thing, lecturing before various groups.
I did have one other question in that area. You've indicated that you are a guest reviewer, or have been a guest reviewer. Can you tell me what that means?
Remember when I said that when people send in an article and it has to be peer-reviewed by various folks, what these journals do is they collect folks in the field who they think would have expertise with reference to a topic, or who they just think knows a lot about whatever it is. And those people that they call to review just one article, as opposed to being on an editorial board, are called guest reviewers, and I've guest reviewed for a large number of journals.
And do you remember the names of any of the areas you've been a guest reviewer for?
Probably most of the journals in this area, American Journal of Psychiatry, Psychological Bulletin, Victims in Violence, Orthopsychiatry. I don't know, I know there's a long list there.
Okay. And as a result of your own research and your own study, have you determined whether there are certain effects of child abuse?
We have certainly established in a number of studies that if you have certain kinds of childhood experiences, you're considerably more likely to have certain kinds of adolescent and adult difficulties.
Okay. And have you established whether there is any intergenerational correlation?
Has the field, or have I?
Has the field?
The field has something called a notion called the intergenerational transmission of child abuse and neglect, which is a long-winded version of the fact that it appears that if someone was badly treated in their childhood, that they have a greater tendency to hurt people when they have kids. So if you were abused as a kid, the likelihood that you will then go on to abuse your kid is higher than if you hadn't been abused as a kid. There have been case studies showing generation after generation of abuse being handed from one generation to the next. Usually studies like this are looking at just the last generation. In other words, if your parents had difficulties in terms of being maltreated as children, sexually or physically or psychologically abused, did that increase the likelihood that they would go on and hurt their kids in whatever ways? And I doubt if any expert witnesses would disagree with the notion that has been shown with great clarity. Perhaps the best article being Kathy Whittam's article in Science, which is our premier science journal, I would say, in the world. And I think her article is called The Intergenerational Transmission of Violence. I'm not sure if that's the exact word, but she established in a large population sample that, in fact, people who were violent or had who treated their kids with greater difficulty were more likely to have come from families where they were themselves hurt.
Do you, or does you, when I say do you, I mean your field generally, do you have any information with regard to the frequency of abuse? How common is it?
Well, yeah, I myself do. Our groups do, and then of course the field does in general. I would say what we've basically shown is over the last 10 years of research, epidemiology of this, the frequency of something occurring in the population. It's probably likely that 20 to 30% of adult women have had some kind of actual physical sexual contact in a child with someone as a child at the hands of someone substantially older. Usually those numbers break out to being someone who was first had sexual contact at 5, 6, or 7 or so in the hands of someone in their late 20s, early 30s, or beyond. That's at the initiation of abuse. Abuse can often go on for a considerable number of years. And of course, some people are abused from birth on, as you know. We see it in the newspapers of sorts of things.
You were referring to women there. Is there information about men?
There are fewer data on men. Most of our research on men, as I would say, been in the last 10 years, and especially in the last 5 years, and especially in the last 1 or 2 years. The difficulty has been that our culture, our society has tended to say that if a boy has been sexually abused, that means there's something wrong with him, that he's gay or he's weird, or that somehow he asked for it. And also that males in our culture are sort of trained to not want to say if something bad happened to them, that it's better not to admit that you're a victim if you're a guy. We call these sex roles, and that society basically says to women it's more okay to say you've been hurt and to feel bad about it than society says for guys that they can do the same thing. I think, and I think a lot of people would agree with me, that this has unfortunately produced a phenomenon where lots of folks men who were abused as children, they don't tell people about it because they feel that they're going to be judged harshly, seen as homosexual or seen as inadequate. And it may be that when they do tell people that
let's hold off and get another question here. Maybe it might help.
Okay. And what is the fear when they do report? You were saying.
I'm not sure. After His Honor interrupted me, I didn't.
I interrupted you because you're beyond the question, so ask another question, please.
Okay, you were talking about the phenomena of males not reporting. You
Right.
indicated that society seems to set standards for them with regard to
Yeah. I mean,
behavior that makes it
the
difficult
basic
to
notion
report.
is that our research, we've been having a harder time establishing the relationship between child abuse effects in men as opposed to women, because men have been much more reluctant to come forward, participate in our research. I can talk a little bit about the development of how the numbers changed. In 1979, 78, we thought that about 5 to 10% of males were sexually abused. However, as the research has dealt, our society is sort of changing, and men are more willing to talk about these things. Now we would estimate that maybe 1 in 5 adult men have been sexually abused as children. We have published 2 studies showing roughly a 20% rate in the last year. So I'm sorry, my answer wasn't responsive. I suspect I was getting carried away with the notion that our culture basically makes it a little different for men to talk about these things than
Your
women.
Honor, there would be a motion to strike the testimony regarding the statistical probability as to men based on lack of foundation.
Do you want me to establish the foundation, Your Honor?
Yes, the objection is sustained, the answer is stricken, and the witness related to percentages and 2 recent studies, and you may pursue it.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Briere, you indicated that the thinking now is that 1 in 5 males, or 20% of the male population, is subjected to abuse. Can you tell me what that's based on?
That's based on, among other things, David Finkelhor, the noted sociologist in New Hampshire's general population study, showing a rate in that range. The LA Times study, if you recall, a few years ago, they made phone contacts with the general population and asked men and women if they'd been abused, as well as our studies published in the Journal of Research and Personality and somewhere else, that in college students, that the rate hovered around 21-22%.
Now, is this situations where you ask people if they've been abused
Where
in
you
a,
ask men if- right.
in a confidential setting?
Right, where they, in fact, their disclosure cannot be related to their name. These are all studies where it's anonymous report.
And what do you think the reliability of that figure is?
I think it's as good as any other numbers we have about any other prevalent social phenomenon. The numbers are fairly stable in the sense that as they're increasing, they tend to be what they are now. We're not finding that one group reports 3%, another group reports 43%. It's just as each year goes by, we find that more and more males are willing to report in various studies that they have been sexually abused.
Is there any sort of definition of the victim in terms of groups, race, economic, any other identifiable characteristics?
In terms of sexual abuse?
Yes. Or psychological abuse or physical abuse?
We think probably lower socioeconomic groups and groups that are more stressed by being in more harsh environments may be more physically abusive, although that's been debated. I would say that that's probably true if you look at the research as a whole. But I think the sexual abuse findings have pretty much suggested that the incidence of sexual abuse is there for different socioeconomic groups, different racial groups. There may be cultural differences in terms of what country, but within the United States, certainly we find that sexual abuse is roughly equally likely to occur in a wide variety of strata, different social groups.
And do you have any information with regard to psychological abuse?
Psychological abuse is a very hard thing to pin down, so I wouldn't want to tell you what was the incidence of psychological abuse, because if you think about it, what psychological abuse is when people make you feel bad, when they humiliate you, criticize you, put you down. And in a little kid, obviously, that would have a pretty profound effect to be told. For instance, Freud's father reportedly said, "This kid will never amount to anything." That may have been why he amounted to something, but the notion is that if you get a lot of verbal criticisms and put downs when you're little, that it has some kinds of impacts. But you can appreciate it'd be very hard for us to figure out, well, were you psychologically abused or not? There's not like a simple demarcation. So I can't actually give you a number. We have several published studies using something I created called the psychological maltreatment scale, which is just, we ask people a bunch of things. Were you criticized, put down, humiliated, made you feel bad in front of other people? And then we add up their answers to that to give a total score. And obviously some people have more of that score than other people do.
And is there any correlation between those who have more of that and any particular economic or racial group?
Actually, that's a very good question that I don't know the answer to. In our research, we've looked mostly at middle-class people or upper middle-class people and have found a general psychological abuse relationship. I would know about other groups.
Move to strike the answer without foundation.
Objection sustained. The answer is stricken.
With regard to middle-class and upper middle-class groups, have you found any correlation?
Yes, certainly.
And what is that correlation?
Objection, lack of foundation.
If you can lay a foundation to the basis of his opinion.
What's the basis of your opinion?
That psychological abuse is associated with later psychological difficulties?
No, with regard to the question of its appearance in middle-class or upper middle-class populations. You said that, I believe you said you gave this test, that's one of the studies you're aware of, gave this test and then evaluated whether there was
Well, I
psychological
can't give you a
abuse.
number associated with it because it's a continuous measure. I can say that different people in our group had different scores on it. It would be very hard to say how many people in that group were psychologically abused.
Okay, but do you have any reason to believe that psychological abuse only occurs among the poor, or only occurs among the middle class, or only occurs among the rich?
I have no scientific basis to make the judgment. I can tell you my impression, but that would be the same as anyone else's.
Okay, but your impression?
Yeah, psychological abuse happens to everybody.
Also speculation of part of the witness. And 801 of the other.
All right, the objection is sustained. The answer is stricken.
In your work, in your studies, and what you've read, your research, have you been able to identify any sort of descriptor of who the sexual abuser is? Is there any definition by age or race or...
Is there a profile?
Yes.
Is there a sexual abuser per se? No, I think
Your Honor, we would object to this as being irrelevant.
Let me have the question read back, please.
In your studies and what you've read, your research, have you been able to identify any sort of descriptor of who the sexual abuser is?
And lack of foundation as well.
Objection sustained.
Have you done any reading or have you done any research in the area of who the sexual abuser is in terms of identifying the person?
I would say that the primary conclusion of the child abuse field and certainly mental health field associated with it is that there's no individual type of person who commits sexual acts against children, but that in fact they can be men, they can be women, they can come from different socioeconomic groups, they can have psychological difficulties that we measure or they may not have any. There doesn't seem to be a sort of a litmus test for who will go on to abuse a child and who won't.
If someone is married, does that take them out of the loop in terms of a possible abuser?
No.
Your Honor, lack of foundation.
Objection overruled. The answer will stand.
If someone has an available sexual partner, an adult, appropriate sexual partner, does that exclude them?
There have been a number of studies on adult child molesters who have been married and had available sexual partners.
Would you expect to see the effects of child abuse immediately? And when I'm talking about child abuse, I'm talking about sexual, psychological, and physical abuse. And so if there's areas that you can only answer one part of it, please let me know, but I'm going to be using abuse broadly in that way. So would you expect to see the effects of child abuse immediately?
Objection vague.
Would you expect to see the effects of child abuse within the first 6 months of a child being abused? If you know.
Well, yeah, I'm not trying to say something I don't know. I'm trying to figure out exactly what's the right answer. I would say that if you look at groups of individuals kids who have been sexually abused. There do appear to be effects that show up for some of those kids fairly rapidly, but I wouldn't want to give the court the impression that every kid who's sexually abused shows up with symptoms that we can identify soon thereafter. In fact, several of us have referred to a sleeper effect where you don't see anything for some time, and there have been several well-known studies that did not show short-term effects of sexual abuse in certain groups of sexually abused kids. But if you were to ask me, does the literature document very clearly that if you look at groups of people, they're more likely to have certain kinds of problems soon after they're sexually abused? The answer would be yes.
And is there a difference between the short-term effects and what you would see long-term in people, if you know?
Okay, that goes a little beyond my competence because I'm not specialized in the treatment of children who are sexually abused. My research and clinical work is with older adolescents and adults who have childhood traumas. I can tell you from my reading the literature, if that's sufficient, that most people seem to...
No question pending and beyond the scope of the witness's expertise.
Sustained.
Well, I believe he's indicated he read the literature. Have you just read one article in Time magazine, or have you reviewed the literature in depth?
I can tell you as an editor, as associate editor and on the editorial boards of many journals, and I have to review this material all the time, that...
Objection beyond the scope.
All right.
I'm just trying to...
This is not your field of expertise?
Well, see, I was trying to be real honest here. I understand you need dichotomies, but the issue that I was saying was, as a person on editorial boards, I've certainly, in the course of my work...
The question I asked was, is this your field of expertise?
Which?
The field that was just the subject of inquiry.
The long and intermediate effects of childhood sexual abuse is my expertise. I've published on short-term effects. I'm just being very honest with the courts that that's not my specific thing that I work with children who have been abused.
All right, ask the question again, and let's ask it as to whether or not this is something that he feels qualified to testify about.
Do you feel qualified to testify about the difference between short-term and long-term effects of sexual abuse or child abuse?
I feel qualified to say that that the literature shows a certain type of short-term effect, and the long-term effects research doesn't tend to focus on those things. For instance, bedwetting and caprices and uresis. I'm just trying to be real honest with you here.
Okay,
so some of those short-term effects you're not going to see in the long-term effects literature. I don't know if you want me to testify to that.
Let me ask you.
Sure.
Do you know, or is there a group of short-term effects that have been identified?
There are a number of behaviors and scores on psychological tests that are seen more in sexually abused children than in other children per the literature and per several studies that we've done.
Okay. And what would the short-term effects be, the ones that have been identified?
Overall.
Well, there seem to be in kids who have been abused a tendency to get in kind of trouble with their peers, to wet the bed, to Friedrich and other people have talked about abuse-reactive kids who tend to be sexually aggressive towards other little kids, getting in trouble in school, etc. And they tend to show on psychological tests what we call externalizing behaviors, which is basically when something's hurting you inside, you do things externally to deal with it, as well as a greater likelihood of anxiety and depression. You have to appreciate, though, in children, we don't have the same kind of ability to really specify what's wrong with a kid in the same way that we do with adults. We don't use the labels in exactly the same ways.
Okay. And what are the long-term effects that you've been able to identify?
There are many things that have been associated with sexual abuse in the literature.
If I may back up.
Sure.
Are you familiar with a concept called battered woman syndrome?
Yes.
Is that actually a medical diagnosis or something that appears in DSM-3?
No.
Answer the question.
Okay. What does that battered woman syndrome, what's that represent if it's not a diagnosis?
Objection irrelevant.
Overall.
Battered women's syndrome as well as rape trauma syndrome basically refer to a series of things that tend to show up in women who have had those kinds of victimization experiences. It would not show up in DSM-3R or any other medical. There are no battered women syndromes than any DSM-3 or other sort of thing. Because, in fact, violence affects different people different ways. So although some people might have A, B, and C, someone else might have D, E, and F. When we refer to a syndrome, that's a specific reference to a cluster of behaviors that occur when an etiologic agent or something that causes a symptom shows up. So if I have A and B, C, D pops out in me, and it always does, we would call that a syndrome. On the other hand, if A happens to me and I do D and F, you couldn't say it was a syndrome because it was just, so we tend to instead to refer to specific effects or sequelae of abuse as opposed to referring to a syndrome.
Okay. And I think we made reference to DSM. And what is that?
That is called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association that goes through various editions. Right now it's in DSM-3R, which is the revised version of the third edition of the DSM, and DSM-4 is around the corner. It's what psychiatrists and psychologists and other mental health practitioners use to identify whether someone has a syndrome or a disorder or whatever.
Have you been able to identify certain characteristics of battered women?
I have never done a research project on battered women.
This is the general your field.
Okay, I'd just like to start. I did run for 5 years a program that had a specific program for treating battered women, so I feel that I can answer that, but I want you to know it's not my research.
Okay.
Okay.
Based on what you've read and conducting and running this clinic for 5 years, is there some agreement in your field in terms of the type of symptoms you would expect to see from a battered woman?
Yes.
And how would you define the term battered woman?
Battered woman was a term developed by a woman named Lenore Walker, and it referred to a bunch of things, but basically it refers to symptoms of another disorder I'd have to bring up now, post-traumatic stress disorder, or P.T.S.D. Do you want me to talk about PTSD?
No, I'd like you to talk about what the experience is of the woman and then what the effects of it are within this group you've identified.
A number of writers have suggested that battered women experience what other psychologists have referred to as learned helplessness, which is that if you're in a situation where you're being hurt and there's nothing you can do to get out of it, and it happens over and over again, you sort of lose or you have some impairment in the ability to think that you can affect the world. So if every time you get up, someone knocks you down, learned helplessness theory says after a while you don't get up. You basically think it's not, you either think it or you react to it as if it's out of your control. A number of people have talked about that in terms of battered women. Battered women, the literature would suggest, also have a lot of anxious reactions, hypervigilance, fear, panic, kinds of reactions, as well as depression. And then some things that are relevant to this thing we call post-traumatic stress disorder, which could be things like flashbacks, fears that you're going to be hurt, sort of a constant dread of danger in the environment, those kinds of things.
You used the term hypervigilance. Can you tell me what that means?
Hypervigilance is a term that refers to the behavior refers to sort of scanning the environment at all times for danger. It's also used by cognitive theorists to refer to a sort of a mindset, a way of thinking about things, that you look at anything in the environment to see if it could be dangerous. People who come into my emergency room are hypervigilant, kind of look paranoid. They're not paranoid, but they're sitting in the room looking around for danger all the time because their experience has been that they've been in danger and they're scared that something might happen to them right now. The actual word hypervigilant refers to that scanning, to that looking around to see if you can detect that.
And is this hypervigilance some sort of mental illness, such as paranoia, or is it more of a reaction to their environment, or what?
Well, paranoia isn't a mental illness, but you mean, is it a psychotic symptom?
Okay.
Hypervigilance is just a reaction to stress. If, say, you were held up today, but you might have hypervigilance tomorrow, I wouldn't say you're mentally ill. I would say that cognitively, if it happened to you, and it might not, but if it did, that you are now looking around to see if anyone else is going to hold you up or if anyone else is going to hurt you.
And have you been able to establish any correlation between what happens to women in a battering relationship and what happens to children in an abuse situation?
Objecting Vegas to abuse in terms of what type?
Sustain.
I think I've indicated that I'm talking about psychological, physical, and sexual abuse.
Then objection compound.
Have you been, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Can you break it down? It might be of help.
Okay. Have you been able to establish any correlation between battered women and battered children or abused children with regard to those who suffer physical violence?
If you mean establish a correlation, I can't imagine how you do a research study to do that. I have written about the fact that I think those are related phenomena.
Can you explain how they're related?
Well, with specific reference to hypervigilance?
No,
To just the
symptoms.
connection between the two types of things.
Yes.
I guess what I would say generally is that if you're an adult and someone beats you up and does it on a regular basis, you develop these sort of fearful reactions and what we call cognitive distortions, which means you start to think about things differently. That's the bad news. The good news is maybe you got all the way through your life until the point you were battered where no one else had done that to you, so you sort of at least have competing notion like, well, so-and-so's beating me, but maybe other people wouldn't beat me. And even though we know that's true, you do tend to develop sort of a helpless feeling and hypervigilance, et cetera. The thing that I and others have remarked on is the problem with chronic early child abuse is that there's no competing data. There's nobody else. There's no other way to look at it and say, well, so-and-so treated me this way, but everybody else treats me fine, because little kids are sort of at the they're at the mercy of who's taking care of them, and they're fairly isolated. So ultimately what happens, I think, is for little kids is that the lessons of victimization are more deeply taken, because you're hurt at a very vulnerable time in your life when you're making decisions and coming up with theories about the world. And based on what happened to you when you were little, that alters those understandings of the world. We sort of know that the things you sort of figure out about the world when you're younger, you tend to carry into your adulthood. And this could mean that abused kids are more likely to hang on pretty tightly to notions of danger and hypervigilance and to have other kind of longer-term psychological difficulties.
Can you say that every child who suffers sexual abuse will manifest the same symptoms, or who suffers physical abuse will manifest the same symptoms? Or are there variables?
Objection, compound.
Overall.
There are no discrete, at least I've never been able to detect any known, if you were abused, you have this problem kind of thing. There's no one-to-one relationship between a type of trauma and a symptom. I guess maybe, if you were horribly, horribly abused, maybe everybody would have flashbacks or something. But generally what we say is that the different complexity or type of abuse, or the way in which the abuse occurred or when it occurred, or et cetera, has an impact on how you're going to respond later, early on and then later. So everybody's, one of the problems I sometimes have when people say, what are the effects of abuse, is that there's no thing called abuse. There's all kinds of abuses. And for instance, if you were not loved and your father raped you, maybe you'd have different kinds of problems than if you were loved and your father raped you. Or if someone tied you to a radiator, but someone else loved you, maybe it wouldn't be as bad for you as if someone tied you to the radiator and that's all you had. So what we realize, we're beginning to show, and I think I've shown in some tried to show in some new research, is that there are a wide variety of variables that have some impact on what kinds of problems you have later on.
Are the types of behavior you described before, though, hypervigilance, assumed helplessness, low self-esteem, depression, are those commonly seen in people who were abused as children, although not necessarily in everyone?
When you study groups of people, you tend to find those effects. Any given person in that group might or might not have that effect.
You've been talking about the effect of abuse on the child themselves. Is there any effect on the child if they see someone else abused, another family member, a sibling, or a parent?
There's actually been some pretty good research and some good writing in that area, and we've done a teeny bit ourselves, but David Wolfe in Ontario, Canada has done some good research on this, and he published a book with another author called Children of Battered Women. That was a book based on empirical research showing that, in fact, kids who are around parents who are being battered by other parents tend to have a wide variety of effects that actually look a lot like being physically abused, probably because they're terrorized. If your father's beating up your mother, that's a very, very frightening thing. Our own research has been more in the cognitive area. We have shown in a study that was out a few years ago in the Journal of Research and Personality that if your father beat your mother, you were more likely to have attitudes that supported you beating your wife if you had a wife who you felt was getting out of line or doing something wrong. In other words, that there was sort of a cognitive transfer from having, if you, for instance, see your father as an important person or someone you value, or just the experience of being with a father who beats your mother, our research seemed to suggest that when you then grow up and you're in interpersonal relationships with, say, a woman, and she behaves in a way you're not happy, you have more supportive attitudes that it's okay to hit her or hurt you. And in our study, you're more likely to report that you would hit her if she engaged in certain kinds of behavior.
Is there any research with regard to women who are raised in a family where their mother is battered? Are they more likely to tolerate?
I think there's something, but I don't know. It's outside.
It's outside your area. Okay. Is there? Do you know anything about what type of coping mechanisms children might have if they find themselves in an abusive lifestyle?
Well, as you know, I've written a lot on that. My sort of view of the long-term effects of abuse is we could call them symptoms, and that's perfectly reasonable, but what they often are coping strategies, and that many of the things that we see as sort of kids in trouble or adults with difficulties are actually things that make perfect sense if you were inside that person, that there would be a reason why they'd do that. So, can I give an example?
Please.
An example would be what we call dissociative states, which is like spacing out or going away or zoning out or feeling numb in your body. Or
What does a dissociative state look like? If somebody's watching you, I mean, do your eyes roll back, or do you go into any kind of fit, or what happens?
No, I mean, it's widely varied, and sometimes it's based on self-report, but I can tell you that watching patients over the years, that it often involves things like a fixed gaze, or we've all done it. It's like when you space out at a traffic light, you kind of go away and your eyes stop moving. When people are dissociated, they often talk in a more stilted way or a more quiet way, a more monotone, because they're not all there in some level. Now, I've suggested in a lot of writing that and we've shown this relationship between dissociation and child abuse in several studies. That's actually a pretty cool coping strategy, that if you can, if someone's hurting you, what would be like your best, what would you do, what would be the best thing to do if someone's hurting you? Well, it might be to go away, or to not feel when they hurt you, or to space out, or maybe even not to remember it, to do anything that keeps it out of complete conscious awareness. So we use dissociation as an example of a coping strategy, that it has some benefit, although it looks like a symptom. For the person herself or himself, it's a solution, albeit not always a real good solution, but you do what you can.
You mentioned before the societal pressure on men and why they would be unlikely to report. So does that mean that you assume that any girl who was being victimized would automatically report, or do the studies show otherwise?
Sustain.
Okay, generally speaking, in addition to the factors you've already described for males' hesitation to report, are there other factors that would make a child reluctant to or unlikely to report?
Certainly.
And what are they?
A large one for both men and women would be shame, the embarrassment of having been abused. I think we sort of get to the point now where we're so used to hearing it, we forget what it would be like for someone who actually experienced it. And the ashamedness, wanting to keep it a secret, not wanting people to know that your daddy or your mommy did this stuff to you. And so it's sort of we call that sort of a suppression phenomenon. You don't share it with other people because you're ashamed of what's happened to you. Also, in some people, I think what happens is you get so used to having been hurt that pretty soon it's the air you breathe, and so you no longer see it as necessarily very abusive. A number of my patients have told me over the years it wasn't until they started getting better did they realize just how bad it was when they were there. The things that they assume that every daddy does, in fact, every daddy doesn't do.
Is fear any part of this? Of the non-reporting?
Disclosing?
Yes.
Well, yeah. First of all, we know that people who are afraid that their perpetrators will find out and get them. Again, I don't know anything about this case, but what we do see is that children who have been threatened, that if you tell I'm going to kill you, or if you tell our relationship's going to mommy's and daddy's relationship's going to break up, or if you tell daddy's going to go to jail, those kinds of motivations we have found are associated with not telling.
Have you identified any fear of the perpetrator themselves?
I wouldn't say, I can't think of any studies where we've actually asked people, no, actually we did, okay. There was one study with Dr. Conti where we asked them what did they think would happen if they talked about the abuse, and one of the best predictors we had of whether they later had symptoms or not was them saying that they thought they would die if they told about the abuse. So I assume that's germane to what you're talking about, that they felt that if they disclosed something really horrible would happen to them. I can tell you clinically, which I'm very comfortable in saying clinically, that many victims are afraid perpetrators will get them when perpetrators are not even around. I mean, you see this in battered women, the woman who believes that the man will come in and kill her, and then you find out the guy's 4 feet tall and a little skinny guy, but the woman thinks he's a monster and he'll get her, and maybe he's in Des Moines, or I guess I shouldn't use that now, but he's in Fargo, and you're here and you're actually safe, yet you have fear of disclosing. So we certainly do see clinically this kind of thing.
Okay. And lastly, you mentioned that you don't know the facts of this case. Have you interviewed either Lyle or Erik Menendez?
No.
Have you read any materials about this case that, other than newspaper accounts?
No.
Okay. So you're testifying just on general theory within your field, is that correct?
Yes, I am.
Thank you. Thank you. I have nothing further.
All right, cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor, may we take our afternoon? No? It's going to be a while.
Okay, let's take our recess then, and we'll resume at 20 minutes after the hour, ladies and gentlemen. Don't discuss this case with anyone. Don't form any final opinions about it. We'll resume at 20 minutes after the hour. Both juries are present, and the witness is still on the witness stand. Cross-examination.
Dr. Briere, in my cross-examination, I'm going to ask if you could speak a little slower so that I tend to talk almost as fast as you do, and if we both do that, the court reporter is going to kill us both, okay?
She warned me.
So could we, all right. Could you describe to me, in the last maybe 3 to 5 years of your practice, what your practice consists of? Like, when you go to work on Monday, what do you do?
Well, it's sort of changed a little bit in the last 3 to 5 years, but I go to the psychiatric emergency room where people walk in with various kinds of problems, and I evaluate them and write up what we call a 4-page write-up in terms of, it kind of gives us an idea of what's going on with them and where they're going to go next. I also supervise clinical psychology interns when they're doing that process as well. Plus lecturing, I lecture each rotation of psychology residents. I also am lucky enough to do a fair amount of research. I have a separate research office that they've been nice enough to give me.
And when you do research, does that consist of interviewing patients and reading the literature, or what combination of that comprises your research?
Most research is conducted where you, on some level or another, present people with a detailed questionnaire and various psychological tests, and based on their responses to those things, you then do statistical analyses and try to ascertain results.
And the groups of people that you research with, some of them are people who are volunteers in a research project, some of them might be people in the general population. Is that how you do it?
Done research on a variety of different groups, including those that you mentioned.
And when you go to the emergency room and you do psychiatric evaluations of people, those people are not there simply for child abuse issues. In other words, it's just whoever walks in.
Right.
So if somebody's standing on the street corner talking to themselves and they come in for an evaluation, you would deal with that kind of person, correct?
If they were able to get in, yeah.
Okay. And this is at County USC? Mm-hmm. Right. In addition, I believe you've indicated that you have a private practice. About what percentage of your work is devoted to your private practice?
I usually see a small group of around 7 patients at any given time in private practice. I operate, it's sort of hard to separate it though, because I operate as part of what's called USC Behavioral Science Associates. So I see patients in USC's new private hospital, if you've seen it, and evaluate people and treat people there. Which is different than county USC.
Right, the 7 patients, that would be, you would be treating on an ongoing basis 7.
At any given time, yeah.
And are those patients people who have problems as adults with child abuse in their past? Is that what you confine your practice to?
You know, most people who have psychological difficulties didn't have great childhoods, so that's probably true of any therapist. It would be true of me explicitly because people know that I work in this area and they tend to come for that. But you know, I've worked with adult trauma, people who weren't victimized in childhood, who were traumatized more obviously in adulthood.
So basically, you spend your day seeing people in distress, a lot of it.
You referring to my training parts?
I'm talking about, I'm not talking about your personal life. I'm talking about what you do for a living. You see people who are in distress.
By training, I meant by my teaching. I mean, it's not my personal life, actually.
The patients that you see are people who are in distress, correct?
Patients are usually in distress, yeah.
What is the psychological definition of normal?
Beats me.
Okay. What is a normal childhood?
Pardon me?
What's a normal childhood?
I can't hear you.
What is
Slow
a-
down.
Okay. Dr. Briere, what is a normal childhood?
Well, you asked me what normal meant, and I told you I didn't know, and then you asked me to define it. I'm confused.
Well, but my point is that you can't really define what a normal childhood is, can you?
No. Mm-mm.
And I believe, well, let me ask you another word. What's a child? When you're talking
It's a
about
rough
child...
questions.
Well, you're the doctor. What is a child?
That's somebody who's young.
Do you have an age limit in mind?
Usually for the child abuse research, we refer to people who are 16 years of age or younger as children.
And would you consider someone over the 18 or over the age of 18 to be an adult?
Yeah, sure. Biologically, you mean?
Well, and legally, you're an adult.
You're a lawyer, right?
All right, let's not argue with
Okay.
with the attorneys either. Mr. Briere, okay? Dr. Briere. All right, your next question, please.
Yes. I believe you indicated you used the term a bad childhood.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Again, would it be fair to say that as a psychologist it's difficult to define the term a bad childhood?
No. I mean, if someone's sodomizing you with a broomstick or something, I would say that you're having a bad childhood.
Okay. What if you want a new car and you don't get that car? Would that be a bad childhood?
Well, I don't even know what that... You mean if a child wanted a new car?
Right.
I wouldn't think a child could have a car.
Well, when you're 16, you can drive a car. I'm not going to argue with you about that.
Council's comments, Your Honor.
All right. Again, no editorializing, just ask your questions,
Okay.
please. Objections to state.
How long has it been that you have centered your professional study on child abuse issues?
I guess when I was clinical director of a community health center in Canada, specializing in crisis, and among the programs was a program for treating adults who are molested as children, and that I think that was 1981. My first paper presentation in the area was in 1984 on child abuse per se.
Would you say that child abuse as an area of specialty is a fairly recent phenomena in psychological studies?
I would say that the field of child abuse has had about 12 to 15 years where it's been explicitly studied.
Are you aware that child abuse is a debated topic right now as it relates to defenses in criminal cases?
Objection. Beyond the scope.
Overruled.
I'm not really that conversant with legal proceedings, so I guess I'm not aware of.
All right, well, let me ask you this then. The children that you've interviewed over the years for purposes of drawing the conclusions, how many of those children have been in custody charged with crimes?
I'm a little confused about the question. I had explained earlier that I don't interview children.
All right, so you interview adults, is that correct?
Yeah.
And the adults that you've interviewed, how many of them have been in custody charged with criminal offenses?
How many adults that I have evaluated in research have
Yes.
been? I don't think any. Or, well, maybe some of them were, but I didn't ask them.
Or you didn't know?
Right.
All right, so would it be fair to say that your familiarity with adults who claim this kind of abuse are people who've gone to you voluntarily, is that correct?
Well, no, not really.
Well, the people who aren't there voluntarily, could you explain how they come to you or how you come to them?
Okay. We had a study in the American Journal of Psychiatry 2 or 3 years ago where we studied Danish males, for instance, longitudinally, who had been physically abused in childhood, and we found that they had a variety of greater likelihood of engaging in violent or aggressive... I'm sorry. I had a variety of later difficulties with aggression or violence, and they were less likely to use words and more likely to use behaviors. Now, in that study, for example, that was a longitudinal study that was followed over years, and I never actually was in Denmark. The 3,000 professional women that we just finished studying, it was a mail-out questionnaire. They weren't a clinical group, and they weren't a college student group. They were just folks who opened their mail one day, and there was a questionnaire.
And they voluntarily returned it, correct?
Yeah.
All right, so it wasn't as if anyone was forcing them to talk about these things, correct?
Right, I think that's unethical.
All right. Now, as a psychologist, when you treat someone, you're trying to give them some sort of cure, or you're trying to make them feel better, correct?
I don't usually use the word cure.
All right.
I think that's more of a medical term.
All right, and so you're not a medical doctor, are you?
No.
If I have a medical problem, let's say I have, let's say my arm hurts because I fell down, and I go to a medical doctor and they take x-rays and they see that there is some sort of defect in the x-ray, a medical doctor would conclude that I have a broken arm, correct? Probably. Yeah. I mean, you're not a medical doctor, but you're a person who's probably gone to doctors, correct?
Objection sustained.
Okay. Dr. Briere, do psychologists have the same kind of standards that a medical doctor does in order to evaluate the data that you get?
I don't understand the question.
When you are interviewing people in order to make these conclusions, you are relying on them telling you the truth. Is that correct?
No, I wouldn't say I'm relying on them to tell me the truth. I'm listening to what they're saying and evaluating it accordingly. I don't necessarily always believe that people know exactly what the truth is. I don't think they necessarily are always telling me the truth.
Do you think that people lie to psychologists?
Definitely.
Do you think that children falsely report that they've been abused?
Do I think children I mean, again, now I've never worked with children, so you're asking me sort of my reading of the literature. I think the literature is pretty clear that some small minority of kids, you can't prove that they've been abused after they say they have.
Would you agree that well, first of all, you did testify to a number of symptoms that children have who have been abused, is that correct? I believe you testified to symptomology of children, even though your focus is on adults. Is that correct?
I made that real clear, yeah.
And children, I believe you indicate, have certain symptoms that that would tend to indicate that perhaps they have been abused. Is that correct?
Sequela.
Sequela. All right. So, sequela means that something follows from something else.
Reliably, as in if you are one way and then you have something else and it keeps happening over and over again, there's a relationship.
Okay, and some of the things that you indicated that a child might manifest would be bedwetting. Is that correct? Is that yes? You have to say yes for the question.
Yes.
But I take it you wouldn't say sitting here today that all children who wet their bed have been abused.
No. Well, I would guess not.
All right. When you were asked questions by the defense attorney about abuse, I believe the questions were using abuse in the generic term. Is that correct? In other words, 3 kinds of abuse: psychological, physical, and sexual.
Yeah.
All right. Is there a differentiation in the kinds of symptomology you would see in an adult between whether they were physically or psychologically or sexually abused in terms of their psychological symptoms?
The difficulty in that area is lots of people who are for instance, if you imagine someone who was raped or sexually assaulted as a kid, it would be hard not to think they were also physically abused. And if it happened in a family, it would be likely they were also psychologically maltreated. So the problem that we have is sometimes you'll see someone who had multiple kinds of childhood traumas, and then they'll have a problem later on, and you can imagine it would be sort of hard sometimes to separate that out. I have done some work as a multivariate statistician, playing with numbers to see if we can figure out, are there some things that be more associated with some things? And I can testify as to what we found. There are some, but I wouldn't want to misstate the literature by telling you that we know that if you're sexually abused only, then X happens, because the reality is that most people who have one kind of abuse may have other kinds of abuse as well.
What if somebody only was psychologically abused and manifested certain symptomology? Would you, as an expert in adult survivors of child abuse, be able to say that that symptomology was caused only by psychological abuse?
If all I knew was that they had been psychologically abused?
Correct.
If what you're asking me is if I only knew they were psychologically abused and then they had problems later, would I say it was only due to the psychological abuse? I wouldn't know, because I would only know they'd been psychologically abused.
Right. Well, I guess what I'm trying to ask you is this. The symptomology that you see in abused children, you can't look at those symptoms and say what kind of abuse caused the symptoms. Would that be fair to say?
It's pretty fair. You probably know yourself from prosecuting other cases, there are some things in little kids, if they do some things, people tend to think of certain kinds of child abuse. But I would agree generally with what you're saying.
One thing that is generic to sexual abuse would be sexualized behavior on the part of the child, correct? If you saw that kind of behavior in a child, then you would tend to think the child had been sexually abused.
The literature tends to suggest that, as you know, there are some studies where it's not entirely clear if all sexualized behavior comes from sexual abuse. But if you were to ask me, is that the thing that we most see that comes out in sexual abuse studies, I would say, yeah, probably.
But other kind of symptomology, like bedwetting, depression, anxiety, those things you can't say came from any one source or another, can you?
Right.
Okay. In addition, would it be fair to say that those kinds of things in a child might not be caused at all by family abuse?
Okay. Again, I want to remind you that my credentials are limited to adolescents and adults. If you're asking me if I were a child psychologist and the kid was a bedwetter, could I say, well, could that have happened outside of an abusive environment? You're asking me to testify beyond my competence. I wouldn't know. I mean...
All right, but you did testify, I believe, that there are certain symptoms that children manifest, and and limiting it, you said, I'm not an expert in child abuse, but you did testify to those symptoms. Are you now saying that you can't differentiate because you're not a child psychologist?
No, not at all. No. I think what my testimony was that in groups of people who've been abused, we find that certain symptoms are more likely to be present. I think I was pretty careful to say that for any given individual person, we don't exactly know whether there will be an effect or a reaction to the abuse. But because abuse tends to cause certain kinds of things, when you study a large number of people, that certain thing is more likely to show up, and we have ways of seeing whether that shows up so much that we would say that it's a finding, that it's a relationship.
What kind of symptoms do you see in abuse? And I'm using abuse in the generic sense. What kind of symptoms do you see in adolescent and adults?
Are you asking me
The long-range symptoms.
of every kind of child abuse?
Well, let me ask you this question foundationally. As an expert in the area of adolescent and adult abuse, are there certain symptoms that you would see in adults that could lead you back to a certain type of abuse?
Do you mind if I rephrase that a little? I would say that there's certain things when we see it, we know statistically it's more likely to come from certain things. Yeah.
And those statistics are based upon all the different studies that you referred to?
Right.
Okay. When you're compiling statistics, aren't you pretty much at the mercy of what people tell you?
Yeah. Generally, if someone indicates a 2 on a questionnaire, we are at the mercy of the fact that they circled the 2. I think that would be true of any endeavor that you would have. You'd have to go with the data that you have.
Right, and so when you as a psychologist are making an evaluation of your data is only as good as the person who's giving it to you, correct?
Well, no, that's actually the concept of statistics, is that any individual's data could be due to absolutely anything. We call that random error variation. So what we do is, if I study 30 of you and 23 of you show a certain kind of thing and 7 of you don't, the statistic incorporates that and looks to see whether the effect is still there. So that's the advantage. That's why how sort of science moves forwards, is we use research and statistics to see if we can sort of detect the signal and the noise, figure out what's sort of there, even though not everybody endorsed it. This gets back to my point that child abuse is a very complex thing, and you can't just find a simple cause and effect that if A happened, then B happens.
Now let's get back to the symptomology that you would see in adolescents or adults. What kind of symptomology would you expect to see from psychological abuse?
Symptomatology?
Well, whatever the word is.
Okay.
I'm not a psychologist.
Okay. You're asking me what symptomatology would be associated with psychological abuse?
Yes, in adolescents or adults.
I guess of our studies, the best one would be something we did in 1988 in the child abuse and neglect, which we found that people who have been psychologically abused were especially more likely to have low self-esteem and to be more likely to have depression.
Okay, so if someone had low self-esteem, you might correlate that to psychological abuse, correct? What if the person was arrogant? Would that be sort of the opposite of low self-esteem?
Well, you may know this, that some arrogant people actually have very low self-esteem.
And some arrogant people are just arrogant, right?
Objection, Your Honor.
I don't know.
Your answer?
I think arrogance is actually a psychological defense, so I would assume that people who are arrogant have something to hide so that people won't notice whatever it is they're trying to look arrogant about.
What other things would you expect to see aside from low self-esteem in somebody who was psychologically abused and who is now an adult?
I now refer to a 1990 article that you could find in there somewhere where we actually asked subjects about their sexual abuse, their psychological abuse, and their...
Actually ask subjects.
Did you? What?
Actually ask subjects about.
Their childhood histories of sexual abuse, physical abuse, and psychological abuse. We looked at all three, and then we tried to see what did we find in that study. Basically, we found that if you were any kind of abuse, you tended to have certain kinds of problems, broad problems, but that each form of abuse was uniquely associated with certain kinds of difficulties. So, for instance, in that study, we found that low self-esteem seemed to be especially hooked up to the psychological abuse, even though you might see sexual abuse victims with low self-esteem. I'm sorry. Okay. If you saw psychological low self-esteem in sexual abuse survivors, this study suggests that that's because many sexually abused people were also psychologically abused. What that study seemed to show specifically was that sexual abuse was uniquely associated with sexual problems. Physical abuse was more uniquely associated with aggression and violence, and psychological abuse was more intrinsically associated with low self-esteem.
Would it be fair to say that not all people who suffer from low self-esteem were psychologically abused as children?
You know what, I would say that, but that's just my opinion. I would guess that the way you have low self-esteem is that people said bad things to you when you were little a lot.
But, all right, if your parents didn't abuse you, you could still have low self-esteem from other factors, correct?
The problem with that is that what we're looking at is who got to you when, and what we know is that abuse that happens earlier is especially likely to affect your personality, and the chronic abuse is more likely to cause effects than acute abuse. So if you asked me who in the whole world of people that a victim would come in contact with would be likely to provide chronic abuse that was happening early, I would say that's probably parents, and that's why, or family members. So that's why I would associate actually those kinds of things with family. But of course, I guess you could imagine a scenario where a kid was loved by his or her parents and then went to boarding school for 8 years and had painful experiences. But I think generally your best shot would be to say, where would you get constant abuse at an early age? And I think the most obvious assumption would be parents.
But there are other causes of low self-esteem in adults, aren't there?
What are those?
Well, for instance, if a child was loved by their parents and developed severe acne, they could not be cured for several years of their adolescence, and their parents were wonderful to them. They still might have low self-esteem because when they face the world sees the acne, correct?
Maybe. I mean, so what that would mean is I would look to see if someone had low self-esteem and they had great families, I'd ask them why they had acne. I mean, my point is you would have to find some explanatory variable. The obvious explanatory variable is people feel bad about themselves because they've been put down chronically and criticized, etc. If you tell me, could they be visited by a space alien and get low self-esteem, that's obviously a possibility. The issue would be, is that credible, or is that... You know what I mean? In other words, is there another explanation that's worthwhile? If we have acne, that would be a good alternative explanation.
Right. If a child was loved by their parents, but was always the last person picked to be on the teams at school, was always put down by their peers at school. Now, let me back up before I complete this question. You deal with adolescents and you deal with adults, correct? And I think you've been very specific that is your area of expertise, correct? Is that yes?
Yes.
Okay, the court reporter needs a yes, that's why I said that. Dr. Briere, at some point in a child's development, the parents assume a lesser role in society and peers and school assume a greater role. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right. And there are things that happen to people that are not their parents' faults that cause them later on to have symptoms. Would you agree with that or not?
You seem to be leading me a little bit. I'm getting. Let me just say. Can I tell you my reaction to that?
Well, okay. I can lead a little because it's cross-examination.
Okay, I'm just asking you. Can I explain that?
To counsel, however, is any argument.
All right, the objection is overruled. You may continue your question if you haven't finished it.
Okay. So my question is this: at some point in a child's development, there would be other stressors and other factors which could cause low self-esteem in adolescents and adults. Would that be correct?
One can imagine an earthquake or any one of a number of things might cause some kind of impacts. I think what my testimony had been was that what seems to especially to determine whether child abuse has long-term effects is when it happened and for how long it happened, whether it was a chronic effect. Okay, so if you're asking me, could someone have had a chronic outside of family experience that would cause them to have a problem, I would agree with you. Yeah, I mean, it would make sense that they could.
Are you familiar with the term malingering? Okay, would you tell the jury what malingering is, please?
Well, actually, you should know that malingering is sort of a legal or lay word, and I think it means like to make things up. Are you referring to like factitious disorder? Do you know?
Well, I was referring to the DSM-3R.
Yeah.
Which this is not a legal journal, correct?
Right.
It's a psychological journal, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And let me, may I approach, please?
Yes.
I'm going to show you page 260 now. Let me ask you something. As a psychologist, do you use this book, this DSM-3R?
Mm-hmm.
Is that yes?
Yes.
All right. And what exactly is that book?
This is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association.
What is the purpose of that book?
Well, there's two separate groups of things. One is to assign a clinical diagnosis, and then the other ones are to define things that are not clinical problems, like what we call V-code problems. So clinical problems are like DSM-3R schizophrenia or something, which might have like a 309.72 or whatever.
Okay, wait.
Then there are things we call V-codes, which are like family problems, trouble with your kid, those kinds of things, which are also in DSM-3R.
Okay, now what is a fee code?
V is in victory.
Okay, what's a V code?
Well, for instance, you just pointed out malingering as an example of a psychological disorder, and I was just pointing out to you that in fact it's listed as a V code, which is not a mental disorder.
Right. What's the difference then between a mental disorder and what you've termed a V? Now, V is just for the section in the book, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right. What's the difference between a mental disorder and what you've termed a V code?
Let me point out what a V code is, as it says in the book that you showed me. A V code for conditions not attributable to a mental disorder. So my original comment that it was not reflective of a actual medical or mental disorder is that phenomenon. It's not me referring to V codes. That's what the book calls it.
All right, so it's everything that's not a mental disorder?
Things that people could come into an emergency room or a clinical setting with that look like they could be a problem, but that the American Psychiatric Association has determined as not to be a mental disorder.
Okay, who decides how these things are classified in this book that you have in front of you?
I can answer that. I mean, I'm not an expert in the DSM-3R as in having written it or anything like that. I can tell you that the DSM-3R and the other DSMs are created by committees formulated by the American Psychiatric Association to decide on what constitutes a mental disorder and what does not. The reason that they needed to create these V codes was because there were a number of things that the courts or others might say were mental disorders were in fact not. For instance, if you came into to a clinic and said, my kid and I aren't just getting along, a diagnostician would have to, because that's the way the system rules, have to write something down and put a number after. We're kind of into that. But you couldn't say that they had mental disorders, so you'd write, for instance, that one would be parent-child problem, which is V61.20. You referred to malingering, which was V65.20. So those are things that are not mental disorders, but they have to be categorized for some reason in terms of paperwork.
So basically, a committee got together of psychologists, I take it, and psychiatrists?
Mm-hmm. Mostly psychiatrists.
And they got together and they decided what things would go into this book. Is that correct?
I think just like any other diagnostic manual, yeah, that's how they do it.
Right. And one of the things that's listed there that is not a mental disorder is a term called malingering. You have it in front of you, correct? Mm-hmm. And one of the things it says is the essential feature of malingering is intentional production of false or grossly exaggerated physical or psychological symptoms motivated by external incentives such as avoiding military conscription or duty, avoiding work, obtaining financial compensation, evading criminal prosecution, obtaining drugs, or securing better living conditions. All right, that's what that book says about malingering. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right. So within the psychological framework that you're dealing with, there is this concept of people making things up, correct?
Right.
Right. And in your practice, when you deal with your private patients who are adults, those people who come to you because they want help from you. Is that correct?
primarily, unless the police or ambulance brought them, yeah.
Right, okay, but I'm referring to your private practice, the people who come to you, they want some help, they want some insight.
Correct.
And the people that you've done your studies on are not people who are attempting to avoid criminal prosecution, correct?
I would assume not.
All right, well, you haven't gone to the county jail to interview these people,
Exactly.
correct?
Right.
All right, so they're not in custody, right?
Right.
Okay. Are you familiar with the notion of people having false memories?
False, you're referring to what the false memory syndrome calls false memory
Well,
syndrome?
okay, is it in fact a syndrome? It's my understanding that the false memory syndrome really isn't an official syndrome.
The term false memory syndrome was developed by a large group of adults who were accused of child abuse, and they formed a foundation called the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, wherein their primary position is that all of their children who accused them of various acts of sexual abuse were actually due to the fact that these people had a syndrome they call false memory. As you may know, the American Psychological Society and various members of various professional groups have said there's no such syndrome, and a little concerned that a lay group would come up with a label like that. So I would say, so when you asked me, I was didn't know what to say, because this is sort of something come up, people who are accused of child abuse have come up with this label.
All right, so they got together and they decided that this was something, okay, but when the psychologists get together and they put up the DSM-3R, when they make that book, they all get together and they decide what's a syndrome and what's not, correct?
There's probably a slight difference in motivation between the two.
Well, I would agree that there is, but it is a similar phenomena. That is people getting together and deciding what is a syndrome and what is not.
Objection, this is argumentative.
Overruled.
Correct?
I'm not sure exactly what you should. Are you saying that labels are created by people?
Yes.
Yes, I think so.
And I didn't call it a syndrome, but you're aware of the fact that there are people who say that people have false memories about things. That is, they create memories. They fictionalize memories. Correct?
Do you want me to talk about that? That's not exactly what they say. Do you want me to?
Okay, what exactly do they say?
Wait, why don't you clarify the question? Are you asking
Okay,
his opinion about whether there's such an event that occurs, or are you asking what something else?
I'm asking you, are you aware of the phenomena that there are people who claim that there is such a thing as false memories?
Yes, it's what I described just now.
All right. Now, as a psychologist, do you have any special kind of way of determining who's lying and who's telling the truth?
No.
Okay. So as a psychologist, you're not any better able than the rest of us to determine who's telling the truth and who's not.
In the study that you may be thinking of, the only group that could detect people better were Secret Service agents. We've never figured out why that is, but that's the only profession that can really detect lies better. It's a fascinating study.
And most psychologists are not Secret Service agents, correct?
I'm not.
All right. So there is no methodology by which a psychologist can look at a person who's reporting child abuse and say, you're lying.
No, well, I mean, certainly people have told me things that I was pretty sure they weren't true. Are you saying whether I had some special ability to discern that they weren't true? No, I mean, you know, I think you would guess, for instance, if you knew someone well, that you can tell more when you think they're lying about something. I think mental health professionals who know the people they work with well have a better sense of when something doesn't seem right.
But that's also true of anyone that you spend a lot of time with, for
Yeah,
instance,
that's my
a
point.
spouse or a child or something.
Yeah, right.
All right. So, but just as a professional, you don't have any professional secrets about how to tell if someone's telling the truth or not. Is that correct?
Right.
Now, I believe you made some reference in your testimony to post-traumatic stress disorder. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Is that, yes?
Yes, it is.
All right. And post-traumatic stress disorder is sort of the foundation for these other phenomena like battered wife syndrome, correct?
No.
It's not correct?
No.
It's not the same sort of phenomena?
You said it was a foundation. Actually, those labels occurred before the diagnosis of PTSD was developed.
All right. Post-traumatic stress disorder then is what? Why don't you tell us what it is?
Okay, it's a little technical. Yeah, slow.
Okay, well,
Okay. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a set of psychological reactions that occur in some people who have experienced a major stress or some really horrible thing, typically a catastrophe or a major act of victimization, etc.
Okay, now, I'm going to interrupt you so that we don't have these long answers without questions, okay? Post-traumatic stress disorder, then, is something that you get when something very, very stressful has happened to you. Would that be a layman's way of saying it?
No, and that's why I was doing a long answer, is because it's a technical thing and it requires, a lot of... Okay, so what I was attempting to point out was that some people, for instance, if members of the jury were to sustain a stressor, say a bomb went off next door, some people would develop some post-traumatic symptoms and some people wouldn't, and we think that's due to all kinds of things that determine how much you react to a stressor. So you wanted to say that, you have a trauma, then you get PTSD, and the point is that there's a wide variety of reactions. So the first point was that people who get PTSD are often people who've experienced a major stressor. What we often say is that it was beyond their ability to cope with that stressor. Okay, and then we get into the 3 qualities of PTSD.
And what are the 3 qualities of it?
3 groups of problems. The first ones are called intrusion symptoms. The second set are called avoidance symptoms. And the third group are called, they're actually called autonomic arousal or anxious arousal.
Now, before you go on and I ask you about this, does post-traumatic stress disorder have anything to do with the phenomena that you've been reporting in adult survivors of child abuse? Is it the same sort of thing?
Post-traumatic stress disorder is one of a wide number of things that can be associated with adults who were abused as children. So I think, for instance, my last article in a maybe 10 or 15, 20-page paper, there were probably 3 pages on post-traumatic stress, because that is, in fact, part of the problem. But a lot of the difficulties, like changing of your thoughts, some of the mood experiences you have, some of the behaviors you engage in, are not, in fact, listed in PTSD, because PTSD is a specific diagnosis that's true for rape victims, casualties in foreign countries, any one of a number of things that are really painful that produce certain kinds of effects. But things like child abuse can produce those effects as well as a wide number of other effects.
All right, but part of the concept of what happens to child abuse victims is contained within the concept of post-traumatic stress disorder.
No.
Well,
Because you could have a really bad child abuse history and not have PTSD. Is that what you're asking me?
No, that wasn't what I was asking you. It's the same sort of phenomenon. In other words, post-traumatic stress disorder, how does it relate then to child abuse victims? Is it one of the symptomologies that they might manifest, but not exclusively?
Post-traumatic stress disorder can arise from a variety of events, one of which for some people is child abuse. I don't want to falsely say to you that most child abuse victims have PTSD. They may have other kinds of problems, and I think you're saying that's all sort of the same thing. It's not. You could have no PTSD symptoms and have significant child abuse effects.
Now, can you have child abuse effects which are caused by a minimal amount of stress? In other words, would it be fair to say that everybody reacts differently to different things?
Yes, it would.
All right. Part of the problem with psychology is that you're dealing with the human mind. That's.
Have you finished your question?
No.
All right.
I'm going to rephrase the question. Okay. As a psychologist, one of the difficulties in setting standards is that you're dealing with the vagaries of the human mind. Would that be fair to say?
You're asking me whether the problem with psychology, you're saying that the problem with psychology is that we have trouble setting, what by standards do you mean by standards?
Well, what I mean is you can't say that if a person is subjected to a certain kind of stress, they're always going to react a specific way.
Right.
Correct? You can't say that all people who talk to you are telling you the truth.
Right.
Right? You can't say that one person exposed to one kind of stress will react identically to somebody else who is exposed to the same kind of stress. Correct?
Well, the last one, the problem with that is that we assume that if we understood the stressor enough, we would understand exactly what the effects are. So I don't think you can say that if 2 people have the same stress, they'd have different reactions, because there's their whole life to look at there. In other words, you come to a stressor with things that are going on with you. What I'm saying to you is that you can't cut and dry say that if somebody had abuse A happen and that they're going to have B, because important other things we need to know is what was it like for them before then? What were their, what we call pre-morbid experiences or pre-abuse pre-morbid, M-O-R-B-I-D, or pre-abuse experiences. If you were unloved and uncared for, and then someone hit you with a car, for example, you might have more problems than if you didn't. But I don't think that's an example of how psychology or psychiatry can identify the relationship. It's just that the relationship is more complex. We need to know about those earlier things before we can understand fully what the later things did.
I believe you indicated that one of the things that is important, at least in your studies on child abuse, is that is family history. In other words, abused children sometimes become abusers. Would that be a fair thing to say?
Yes.
All right.
That abused children sometimes can become abusers.
But not all abused children become abusers.
As far as I know, that's true.
Right. So to say that someone's family history is a predictor of how they're going to behave, would you say that that's correct or incorrect?
It comes down to, again, what the abuse was. See, the question you asked me, and you had said that we were talking about generic abuse here. Generic abuse, we cannot predict what it will do in terms of its long-term effects because it's generic. I assume that at some point, if we keep doing science well, we will know exactly what it takes to make a perpetrator. At the current time, we don't know why one person who is abused goes on and to perpetrate and another one doesn't. We assume that what we don't know are certain aspects of the abuse and what the person's life experience was beforehand. You have to appreciate that the human experience is very complicated, and it's going to take a long time for us to fully figure this out. What we have established, though, is that there is a statistical link between childhood trauma and later violence against others, and that link tells us there's something there. What we don't yet know are all the little pieces that would allow us to predict it completely. This is going on.
Well, the reason,
away from it a little bit.
yeah, the reason it's popping is that when you get really close, it will do that. Now, I want to ask you a little bit about the battered wife syndrome. Now, the battered wife syndrome is a psychological diagnosis or a psychological phenomena. Is that correct?
We don't call it the battered wife syndrome because it's not always wives. It's battered woman syndrome, and so it could be a lover, it could be anyone.
All right. All right. But what precisely is the battered wife syndrome? Is it a diagnosis? Is it a collection of symptomology? What is it?
As I described to you earlier, there's no actual DSM-3R diagnosis of battered woman syndrome. It's a label some people have applied to something, and I think the California courts have taken that label seriously, but I can't tell you that in this book there's any reference to there may be under PTSD, but there's no formal diagnosis for battered woman syndrome.
All right, but I think you were asked some questions by the defense attorney about it, correct? And you were asked whether there were some similarities between that and what happens to children.
Right, and I gave very careful answers, and that the reason I gave those careful answers is because we're dealing with intangibles here. Since there's no diagnosis per se in the book, I can't tell you exactly what battered woman syndrome is. I can tell you that Lenore Walker and other people for that rape trauma syndrome, Burgess and Holmstrom, other people have talked about things you tend to find in people who've had those kinds of experiences. And that is, in fact, what I try to very specifically relay in my testimony, and not to give the impression that we're talking about a very simple thing or something that occurs for all people, or that it's a legitimate psychodiagnosis in the way that I think you're referring.
Would you say there's any difference between a woman who's battered and a child who's battered?
A woman who's battered is older, and a woman. She's had a chance to live a life prior to the time that she was battered, and a child certainly hasn't, or not as much of a life.
Would you say there's any difference between a woman and an adult who is a survivor of child abuse?
You're asking me, are there any differences between a battered woman and an adult survivor of child abuse?
Right, or an adult who's still, let me give you a different hypothetical, adult who is still in a battering relationship. Do you think there's a difference between like an adult male who's in a battering relationship and a woman who's in a battering relationship?
I'm not sure what your question is.
Well, let me ask you this. A woman who is in a battering relationship, traditionally it's with a man, correct?
Actually, the newest research you may know talks about the fact that in lesbian relationships, it turns out there's a lot more battering than we had previously thought.
They're with someone that at some point they chose to be with, correct? In other words, these relationships at some point were voluntary relationships. Is that correct?
To some extent, yeah.
All right.
Depends on
People choose mates voluntarily, correct?
Well, I would point out that, you want the answer? I would point out that we do know that battered women are more likely to have been sexually abused as children, and one of the assumptions that a lot of people make is that by virtue of having been victimized early in life, that sets you up for expecting or wanting or interpreting or allowing certain behaviors that other people wouldn't. So I'm not sure if you actually, do you appreciate what I'm saying? If you're a child sexual abuse victim and then you're in a destructive relationship, most of us assume that to some extent your childhood is how you got into that relationship.
But as an adult, you can make choices in life, regardless of what's happened to you as a child, correct?
Objection, argumentative.
Rephrase the question, please.
Can an adult who's been abused make voluntary choices in their adult life?
Well, let's say that I was horribly abused as a kid. Are you saying could I not have flashbacks at 42?
No, I'm saying could you make voluntary choices as to who
About
you want
what?
to spend your life with?
I think that most untreated adult abuse survivors have their childhood abuse playing out in their relationships. And I think most people who've been abused would say that they notice all sorts of things in how they relate to other people later on that are based on things they learned or things they're afraid of or things that they understood in their childhood.
When a woman is in a relationship with a batterer, be it a man or a woman, at some point she chose to be with that person and perhaps even love that person. Would that be fair to say?
I'm going to object on that question. It's argumentative. I think it goes beyond everybody's particular expertise.
All right, objection sustained on the latter ground.
Right. You testified, though, about the battered woman syndrome, correct?
No.
Well, you were asked questions about it and you made analogies, didn't you, to the child abuse situation?
I think I've been fairly clear about what I did or didn't say. I'm not sure what you're wanting from me right now.
Well, what I'm trying to do is differentiate between a woman in the battered woman's situation and a child who, as an adult, chooses to stay in that situation. Do you think there's any difference?
No, I'm going to object to the formal question since that's not in evidence.
Overruled. Do you understand the question?
Yeah, as I think the last time you asked the question, I said that a person who is battered older and later in life may have had the luxury or was lucky enough not to have had a horrible earlier life. So that's a difference. So that one's an adult and one's a child, and the fact that in fact a child who's been abused doesn't have that chance to at least have had some kind of a okay life to compare the treatment they're getting against. If you are being badly treated when you're little, you may think that, and in fact many people say this, you think that what's happening to you now is how you're supposed to be treated because that was all you knew then. I think that's potentially a difference because hopefully some people who were victimized in their adulthood thought things were basically okay and then some bad thing happens to them. And under those conditions, I assume that they're a little better off because at least I can say to them or they can work out for themselves, geez, this is bad, but maybe not all things are bad. That you might have some more perspective if it just happened to you as an adult.
Are you familiar with the term of suggestibility as it relates to child abuse?
Yeah.
Okay, what does that mean to you?
Suggestibility as it relates to child abuse. Are you talking about child witnesses?
Yes.
Okay. Well, again, I would point out to you that I don't work with children, and I certainly have never testified in terms of a child in the courts. So, I can tell you what any psychologist would say, which is that I know that suggestibility is when people can be more readily talked into things than other folks. And so if you're asking me suggestibility in children, I assume that you're asking about that, but I wouldn't say that I have any special expertise in how I would answer that.
But I asked you what it means to you. As a psychologist, what does suggestibility mean to you?
Okay, so I've explained that then.
All right. And are you aware of the fact that there is some feeling in the child abuse field that suggestibility can taint a child who claims to be the victim of child abuse?
You're referring to a study? Right?
Well, I'm talking about in the field that you're involved with. Are you aware of the fact?
Oh, but you're saying that there's a fact. I'm trying to understand how you know that or what you mean.
Well,
What's your basis for?
Well, cross-examining other experts, I guess, would be my basis. So,
Your Honor, I'm going to object to that statement.
All right, why don't you just rephrase the question?
okay. Dr. Briere, if somebody were charged with an offense and they wanted to fabricate symptomology of child abuse as an adult, could they do it?
Call it for speculation, Your Honor.
Overruled.
Of course. I mean, anyone can say anything under any circumstances. Certainly a person could say that they were seeing monsters.
All right, and so when I pointed out to you that part of the DSM-3 about malingering, one of the things it said is that malingering should be suspected if someone's involved in legal proceedings. Is that correct?
I think it lists things under which that's associated.
That's correct then, correct? Right?
Yeah, sure.
All right. So it is possible then for an adult to manufacture symptomology which would be consistent with a true child abuse victim, correct?
Well, you were in good shape the first half of the question because anyone can make anything up. Are you asking me, would the average person accused of a crime, would they know what to say in terms of what are, because you said consistent with a true child abuse victim. I'm just going by what you said. Is that what you're asking me? Would the average person who was lying about this stuff know just what to say? Is that the
No, that
question?
wasn't my question. I'm just saying, could it happen?
Could what happen?
Could a person manufacture the symptomology of having been a child abuse victim in order to avoid criminal prosecution?
They would have to know what the effects of child abuse are. If they somehow knew those things, of course they could. They could be they could pretend they were schizophrenic too.
Okay. People do pretend to have psychological symptomology when in fact they do not have the things that would cause that symptomology. Is that
Right.
correct?
Correct.
All right. And so you have no personal knowledge of this case, is that correct, other than what you've read in the newspaper?
Probably everyone in this room knows more about this case. I haven't even read very much on it.
And you've never interviewed the defendants in this case?
Never seen them before.
And you've never interviewed any of their family or friends or anything else?
No.
When was it that you were asked to come and testify in this case?
It was about a year ago.
Now, you said that if a person knew what to say, then they could manufacture the symptoms. Is that
I was
correct?
trying to make sense of your question when you said that they would look exactly like a true child abuse victim. I was trying to think, well, what did she mean by that? And then the only thing I could come up with is that somehow she would know how a true child abuse victim would look. That's why I answered that way.
Well, one of the things that you testified to is that one of the things that you see in adolescents and adults is low self-esteem, correct?
Correct.
And you would also, perhaps if you were sexually abused, have sexual problems, correct?
Yeah.
All right, so that if a person knew that those were two things associated with child abuse, that person could make reports of low self-esteem and or sexual problems, correct?
They could make those reports, sure.
All right, and it wouldn't take a brain surgeon to be able to manifest those particular kinds of symptoms.
Objection, Your Honor.
All right, it is argumentative.
Okay, Dr. Briere, do you understand what I'm trying to say?
No.
Well, in order for someone to make up symptoms, all they would have to do is know what it is they need to make up.
Okay, are you saying make up symptoms and get away with it, or make up symptoms like anyone in this room could say, well, Alzheimer's disease means you don't remember, so I'll say I don't remember. Is that what you're referring to?
Well,
The
yeah,
second?
I'm referring to if people want to be diagnosed a certain way and they know what the symptoms are of people who have that particular defect, they could manufacture those symptoms.
They could make up those symptoms. I would hope that a good clinician wouldn't randomly assign the diagnosis just because someone said the right things. I'm not an evaluating clinician in this case, so I have no idea what you have in store here. But the idea of being a good clinician is that those years of training and experience allow you to make informed judgments.
But I think you said earlier that you don't have any way of really telling when someone's lying to you as a psychologist,
Counsel's argument.
Overruled.
correct?
You asked me specifically about lying. If you were, for instance, to lie to me right now, I might not be any better than anyone else in this room about knowing whether you're lying. I would guess that I am, but the data do not show in studies of psychologists that I would. But if you ask me, if I come in here and I present to you with a full-blown case of PTSD and I'm not a psychologist and I don't know what's going on, and I'm not a psychologist and I don't know what's going on, and you came in my office, would I be able... Would have all my years of training and experience allowed me to think maybe you didn't have full-blown PTSD? Yes, I certainly hope so. That's my profession. You appreciate the difference between saying if you tell me you had an egg roll yesterday and you didn't, and I can't tell the difference between that. That's not equivalent to saying if you present with a bunch of things that I, as a trained clinician, won't figure out, well, does that make sense? Is that what the literature shows? Geez, she suddenly talked about egg rolls, and egg rolls never show up in this diagnosis. I would hope that an informed clinician makes those we call those differential diagnoses, and we do them quite often. For instance, in the emergency room, I sometimes make, if someone's saying that they're crazy and they don't seem crazy to me, to use lay language, I'm not going to say they're crazy. I'm going to make those judgments.
But if a person spent a couple of years preparing themselves to tell you that they were crazy and was very motivated to have you believe that they were crazy, you could be fooled, couldn't you?
Yeah.
Objection, Your Honor. That's argument.
Sorry. Overruled, the answer will stand.
Thank you. I have nothing further.
Any redirect? You didn't indicate that you wanted one. All right, well, let's proceed with Ms. Lansing, since she conducted the direct examination on behalf of both defendants. All right, we'll proceed with Ms. Lansing.
Dr. Briere, you were asked in the very beginning of the cross-examination about what happens when someone comes into the emergency room, and you said you do a 4-page write-up. Is that correct?
Correct.
What type of information do you take from them?
I wouldn't want to say that the whole world of clinicians does it that way. I was just referring to County USC's evaluation. There, the first section is about the presenting problem and the history of the problem, how long has it been going on, et cetera. Then we go on to check out their other things that they've reported, physical problems and other kind of problems that might be explanatory. We move on to their childhood histories. Were they maltreated as children? Do they have biological histories of depression or schizophrenia? Did any of their family members in previous generations have biological problems like schizophrenia? Then we have a thing called a mental status examination, which is a whole series of questions about do they know where they are? Is their memory working? Those kinds of things. It proceeds like that for 4 pages.
Okay. And I presume if you're seeing someone in treatment, you're going to go with more depth into those areas.
Right, that's just an emergency room evaluation, a treatment evaluation. Not only does it take a session, but at least I believe and have written that assessment has to continue throughout treatment. Some people, for instance, will not report things that are critically important to understanding their situation for years. Especially things like sexual problems or things they're embarrassed of, or drug use. It could be any one of a number of things that they don't have enough trust. I often joke, I don't think this audience is in the mood for jokes, but I often joke that it's amazing that anyone in our clinical studies will tell us a thing, given that they don't have any trust based on us. We're just asking them, have you ever been abused? And clinically, actually what happens is, in the real life working through of these kinds of things, is it takes a long time to say scary things to anyone, things you're embarrassed of, things you feel humiliated by. And I can honestly tell you...
The objection is sustained. The answer is stricken.
When you see patients in treatment, do you go into greater depth in the types of areas you've described in the assessment? Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay. And do you find that people are able to come up with all of the information that is important to your diagnosis and treatment in 1 or 2 sessions, or does it take a longer time?
It takes a longer time.
And when you say a longer time, could someone be in treatment with you for 3 or 4 years and still not reveal things that are clinically important?
Very, very definitely.
And what types of things would they be likely not to reveal if you know?
There can cause for speculation on part of the witness.
Sustained. Sustained.
In your experience, are there types of things, and I'm not talking about a specific instance they report, but in terms of its effect on them, are there types of information that are more difficult than others for people to reveal?
I would say there's 2 general types of material that is not quickly ascertained in therapy that takes a long time. Things that the patient or client is ashamed of or feels humiliated by. You can imagine that would take a long time to trust someone enough to tell them. And things that cause them to remember or re-experience painful things. Many people, for instance, in therapy won't, if a woman is battered in therapy and she's talking to me, she'll skip over the battering. She'll say, and then he hit me, and I'll say, well, what's that about? And she'll go, it's not important. What that's her way of saying is, I don't want to talk about it because it hurts a lot to think about it, to feel it. So between shame and not wanting to re-experience trauma, I think that's part of the art and science of psychotherapy, is the slow unfolding of that process.
Mrs. Bozanich asked you if you could define the word normal and the concept of normal childhood, and you indicated you couldn't.
Right.
Does the term abnormal have any meaning in your profession?
Abnormal actually is more of a statistical statement. It means, does this thing occur not very commonly?
Okay. And then I'm probably not asking you the right question. Can you identify traumatic childhoods?
If as a expert or whatever it is that I do, if someone tells me things that happened to them in childhood, I can make a judgment of whether I feel that was traumatic for them.
And if people tell you about a number of painful things that happened in their childhood, Can you then say this was not a normal childhood within the lay definition, or does the term normal have any meaning at all?
I understand that that's more of a legal concern than it is a mental health one. I frankly don't think there are a lot of normal families out there. Excuse me, but I suspect we all have something going on within, so it's sort of a continuum notion for me. I think there are families where kids are more loved and taken better care of than other families, but you appreciate that sort of different than saying normal? I mean, you could imagine that treating your kid really, really well might be abnormal in this society. I mean, we're talking about, are you being loved? Are you being taken care of? Are people doing mean things to you or not? I would rather think about it that way.
So it's a question of degree. Is that true? Every child probably gets yelled at their parent, and at some point that would become abusive if it was extreme. Is that fair to say?
That's fair to say. It might be different situations. That same yelling might mean different things. I mean, you can appreciate it would be complex.
I think one of the questions that was directed to you was child abuse, and you indicated it was 16 or younger. Now, is that tied to when it starts, when it stops?
You know, this is all sort of relative. We could say anybody who's sexually abused at 17 or younger that's abuse, because that's under the age of majority. We just often use as a convention 16, and that would be when the abuse began. Many cases of abuse continue years after the person is 18. In fact, one of my books, I refer to a very specific problem for therapists, which is not to assume that the abuse has ended while you're working with the person, but to know that sometimes people stay in these painful relationships, and they're often afraid to tell the therapist that that's what's going on.
I believe you were asked if 18 meant you were an adult, and I think you conceded that legally that's correct. Do people mature at different rates?
I guess that's what I was thinking of, which is that, you know, I think that mental maturity, whether you're an adult or not, is highly variable, as you can imagine. You know, I'm not trying to make that sound like that's just science. It's just some people are far more mature at 18 than other people are.
You mentioned that forcing someone to talk about abuse would be unethical. Did I understand you correctly?
I'm not sure exactly what I said. Something to that effect.
Is that true? Is forcing someone?
In research, yeah, I think that forcing people is generally unethical in the mental health field. Forcing someone to talk about something in research would be considered unethical at the American Psychological Association level.
What about in treatment? Do you have to just wait till people are ready to discuss issues?
Right. I mean, I have a real problem with some therapists who push their clients to talk too fast, to use hypnosis or sodium pentothal or other things to get at memories. I think that that's not helpful. I think, and what really needs to happen is people need to be in a safe environment where they can slowly talk about things and slowly get into things. You run the risk of re-abusing people if you sort of deal with your issue right now, talk about your abuse. If you think that if you had a lot of abuse and someone told you to talk about it right now, you'd either stop talking, or if you did talk, it might hurt you. So we approach, at least my philosophy is to take a long time at that and to do it piece by piece over time.
How much longer do you think you have?
Probably about 10 minutes, Your Honor.
All right, we'll take a recess and we'll resume tomorrow at 9 o'clock. Ladies and gentlemen, don't discuss this matter with anyone. Don't form any final opinions about it. We'll resume tomorrow at 9 o'clock. If each jury would return to your respective jury room tomorrow at 9 o'clock.
I have patience then.
You were being cross-examined yesterday. I believe you were asked a question about sexualized behavior, whether this is one of the forms of behavior you might see in someone who was a molestation victim themselves. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Okay. And can you tell me what you mean by sexualized behavior?
I'm not sure I introduced the term, but sexualized behavior refers to behavior that has sexual elements to it. When we say sexualized, it often suggests inappropriate behavior that has sexual content or a sexual aspect of it.
Would you expect to see this form of behavior in a young child, or is it something that only manifests itself as they get older?
Certainly the literature is filled with studies and reports of children, especially children who've been sexually abused, engaging in seemingly precocious or surprisingly, shall we say, mature sexual behavior given their actual chronological age. So, for instance, Dr. William Friedrich, who is probably our major expert on sexualized behavior, has a number of studies documenting that sexually abused children will engage in things such as mounting other children, or excessive masturbation, or preoccupation with sexual themes. I have developed a psychological test called the Trauma Symptom Checklist for Children that has a whole scale measuring sexualized behavior, because it in fact is such a significant aspect of child abuse trauma in small children. It certainly does manifest in older people, which is why we also have in our adult scale a similar scale measuring sexual behavior in adolescents and adults. That's the primary notion.
Okay. When you talked about long-range symptoms, is there a list that your profession recognizes of forms of behavior where there is a correlation between that form of behavior and abuse? I mean, do you have like 10 or 15 forms of behavior that are linked to childhood maltreatment?
The research literature would document any number of things that have been associated in one or more studies with childhood sexual abuse. The problem is, of course, that there may be various pathways to that behavior. Nevertheless, we have established certain behavioral activities that seem most directly related to certain forms of childhood victimization.
And how many are there on the list?
Well, the real short list, which would be things that we'd pretty much, it seems to be that relationship holds in a number of studies. For physical abuse, it would be aggression towards others, difficulties with anger, temper, control of anger, violence in various forms. Children who have been physically abused in several studies, including one of our own, turned out to be more likely to beat their wives or be violent to their sexual or romantic partners. Sexual abuse in childhood has been associated in a number of studies of sexual abuse perpetrators as being related to crimes against children by the victim as they grow up. So there are a number of... Go ahead.
I'm sorry, did you talk about other symptoms such as dissociative behavior, bedwetting, that type of behavior?
Okay, bedwetting is more associated with responses of children as opposed to adults, although I do actually I have worked with some adult folks who still do wet their beds who were profoundly abused as children. The problem with bedwetting or soiling your sheets or whatever is those are pretty general responses to childhood distress. So if your kid's doing bad in school, she might do some of those behaviors. We tend to look at the more profound behaviors, the ones that sort of rise above the noise, the ones that really stand out. And that tends to be aggression, sexual acting out, sexual behavior.
And do you see this in everyone who was abused as a child?
It's kind of hard to prove the negative. So the problem we have is that when I study 500 people, and some of them say they were abused, and some of them say they went on to victimize other people, the problem we have is that some people said who said they weren't abused may have been abused. Some who said they were may not have been. And in adulthood, we don't know if in fact, I think it's unlikely that everybody confesses to crimes they've committed in a research study. So you can appreciate that it would be relatively difficult to determine what the exact relationship is. Having said those scientific type things, I would say that there does seem to be a strong relationship, but nothing near a one-to-one relationship. Not every person who's been physically or sexually abused, as far as I'm aware, goes on to perpetrate against others.
You were just talking about the data that you use for these studies, and I think Mrs. Bazanish brought out the point that it's a product of self-reporting.
That's correct.
Is that correct? And so, obviously, anybody could lie to you.
Correct.
Is that correct? Do you do anything in these studies to try to counteract that obvious possibility? Or is there anything that makes you trust the data?
Well, all of human science proceeds on the basis of what people say or what you observe of people. I think the primary thing here, and I've written about this at length, is that as the prosecution was referring to malingering being a motivated behavior, the point here would be that if someone's going to lie in a research study, one would guess that they would have to have a reason for that. So if you did a study where you knew their name and there might be some chance that they would get something out of it. But these studies that I've just described to you, and I would say the vast majority of the child abuse studies, are done entirely anonymously. What that means is that when a subject fills out a questionnaire or whatever, in these studies, anonymity is a very important part of the process. So if John Doe writes down that he was sexually abused as a kid and that he beat up his wife as an adult, there's no discernible or obvious motive for why he would lie on a piece of paper when that piece of paper is never going to be traced back to him because his name isn't even on the questionnaire. Okay. So, I think it gets to why would someone make something up in research? And I don't think there'd be profound reasons if it's anonymous.
Okay. In your testimony on cross-examination, you referred to the terms of chronic and acute with regard to child abuse, early abuse. Could you tell me what you mean by chronic and what you mean by acute?
Yeah, that was unnecessarily technical. Chronic abuse in the field refers to abuse that's gone on over and over and over again. So if you were abused at 3 and at 3.5 and 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 on into whenever, we would consider that to be a chronic abuse scenario. The reason we refer to acute is that in the more general trauma field, we see people who just experience a single massive trauma like a rape or an assault or a shooting. And in child abuse, there are a large number of victims that are studied who had a single sexual abuse contact or who were hit once or thrown down a flight of stairs once. And under those conditions, we typically refer to that as acute, meaning immediate, one time only, or what's happening at a moment as opposed to across time.
When you were talking about the chronic, you were talking about happening at 3, 3.5, 4. To be chronic abuse, it doesn't need to happen every single day, does it?
Chronic abuse implies that it occurs on multiple occasions, but the point is, for instance, let's say you were beat on Tuesday, and then you were beat on Friday, and then you're beat on Monday of the next week. Now, at this point, you're ready to be beaten, and you're fearful that you'll be beaten. So you might not have to be beaten on Tuesday to still feel very, very frightened. It's also true that psychological abuse usually occurs in the presence of physical abuse. In fact, it would be hard to think about any other way that it would happen. So if someone beats you up on Tuesday and says, I'm going to beat you up on Wednesday, that obviously would continue to add to the terror that the person would feel because you never know when, in fact, you're going to be hurt again. This is especially referred to in the battered women's field where one will be beat 3 or 4 times in a marriage and then defense attorneys or whomever will say, well, it's not happening anymore, but the point is for that woman, the experience is still there and she's still afraid she will be hurt. And clearly, that sort of scenario plays out a lot for children who, in fact, don't have anyone else to turn to for safety. There's not really anywhere else you can go in many cases.
And do chronic abusers behave badly every single moment of every single day to children, or are there good times?
It varies widely. I think there's just some bad parents who are mean to their kids all the time, and that's obviously a difficult scenario. I sometimes think that an even worse scenario, though, is where someone is really mean to you on Tuesday and Wednesday and great to you on Thursday and Friday because you end up not being able to predict what's going to happen when. And I think that creates a
Okay, you've answered the question. Your next question, please.
Thank you. You were asked about false memory, the concept of false memory. And is that a concept that is discussed in your field?
It's under discussion currently, yes.
Okay. And can you tell me what false memory is, what it refers to in your field?
The field tends to be responding not to people who've created that. The people creating those terms did not come from the child abuse field. They came from a large group of parents who were formerly accused of child abuse who believe or who present that their accusers had false memories of the abuse. it is currently a very big debate because we're very concerned about, the implications of the possibility that some people say they were abused when they weren't. So it certainly is something we're discussing currently.
Okay. If you are evaluating a person to determine whether they were abused or not, Mrs. Bozanich made the point that anybody could lie to you. Is that correct?
Correct.
And do you have any training or any methodology in which you try to determine the accuracy of the information, as opposed to people who may, for no other reason other than they don't want to talk about the particular problem, they may describe a different problem. So do you have a way to sort that out and try to determine as best you can?
I think that was what I was referring to yesterday. If someone tells you a single thing and it's a lie or not, maybe I wouldn't be any better than anyone else would be in determining whether that was a lie. The issue, though, is when you're in therapy or when you're doing an evaluation that you look at the pattern of responses and you listen very carefully over time to the consistency of the reports or whether it makes sense and whether it connects up with other events. You also have the opportunity to talk to other family members or to police agencies or the courts or whomever if there have been, for instance, reports in the past of the abuse. So you get corollary data as well to kind of flesh this out. Even, in fact, the folks who talk about the possibility that abuse victims are not, in fact, victims say that corollary data from other sources is sort of the height of the best we can do to investigate whether those things did happen.
With regard to the perpetrator, you were asked some questions about the perpetrator, and I think you indicated before there was no definable profile. Can a sexual abuser look like you or I?
Objection. Calls for improper opinion.
Why don't you rephrase the question, please?
Can they look like a normal person, if that term has any meaning for you?
Certainly, although some people claim to be able to detect abusers in a crowd, I don't think that, in fact, that's true. The reality is that people who have abused other people pretty much look like other people. That's the problem.
Can they function in society normally, hold down jobs, have families, be members of social organizations?
Certainly that.
Beyond the scope across.
Overall.
Certainly the courts, the media are filled with cases of substantiated abuse by people in the movie industry and government, police officers, et cetera. It's certainly not something that only occurs in the unemployed or in a lower socioeconomic group.
Mrs. Bozanich was trying to contrast the experience of the battered woman versus the adult male in terms of leaving a relationship, the ability to leave the relationship. Is there any information that we have with regard to are adult males, 18, 21-year-old males, vastly more independent or more capable of leaving, or the same? Can you comment?
Objection. Misstates the testimony in this argument. Misstates the question in this argument.
Well, look, if I may just ask the question.
All right.
Is there a difference between adult males, say 18 and 21, and battered women in terms of the ability to leave a relationship?
Objection. Beyond the scope of his expertise.
Objection sustained.
Do you have any expertise in that area, Doctor?
Which area?
The area of evaluating the difference between an adult male's ability to leave and a battered woman's ability to leave a relationship.
The expertise would only be that I've worked with both groups extensively. I don't know if that would be sufficient for the court.
Have you read material?
And I've evaluated a large number of male abuse survivors and a large number of women who are battered.
Okay. Can you answer the question then?
Objection. Improper opinion.
Objection sustained.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the objection.
Improper opinion.
Because the foundation's not there?
I'll see it sidebar if you like.
Okay, thank you.
Goes beyond sex is what was it like for you as a kid and what sort of assumptions did you make about the universe? I certainly know of a number of abused males who stayed in, especially in highly conflictual relationships.
What do you-
Your Honor, there'd be a motion to strike everything after the first sentence as being non-responsive. The question could be answered yes or no.
Objection sustained. The answer is stricken.
You indicated that in a highly conflictual relationship, was that your word?
Yes.
Okay, that there is a stronger likelihood that someone will stay. Is that correct?
Correct.
Can you define the term for me?
What I meant was in relationships where there's both good things and bad things, there's a confusion, or there can be a confusion in the person about what to do next. If you were badly treated and also treated with love or respect, you may, for instance, want to stay to get the love and respect and feel that the maltreatment is punishment for bad things you've done as opposed to actually cruelty at the part of your perpetrator. So ultimately what happens is that you want to stay to kind of prove yourself or to justify yourself or to get the good things from the parent that you don't often get and that you want more of, like any person growing up would want.
Okay, thank you. I have no further questions.
All right.
Dr. Briere, I believe you indicated that some people will stay in conflictual relationships because there's certain things in the relationship that are to their benefit or that they want.
Correct.
Is money one of those things that someone might stay in a relationship for?
Geez, I don't know. That's not what I meant.
But it is one of the factors that someone might stay in a relationship for is money.
Objection argumentative.
Well, I don't mind.
Overruled.
Okay. I don't know if a kid stays in a relationship for money. It's not something that comes to mind, but perhaps it's something I'm not aware of.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right, anything else? Okay, thank you. You may step down. You're excused. Your next witness, please. All right, sure.